your solutions and your conversations. We tried not to be proprietary with anything that we do because we think really like gender equity work is totally mission driven. It's not about profits for anyone. All of these nonprofits that exist that are keeping their methodology or their curriculum very private. I think that there's a bit of a missing the forest through the trees in that one. Funders really, on a lot of ways, actually reward that. You have the best curriculum, you make the biggest change, so we're going to give you this grant. But ultimately, I think it's kind of counterproductive that we aren't just all sharing what it is we know, and our ability to accelerate the work increases. So, but this other, I think the other piece around these general supporters, so people that you just want, if you're running a nonprofit or a girls sports team or a boys sports team or any kind of initiative, you just want more supporters. You want more people to know. And during my 10 years at the Women's Sports Foundation, I worked in communications, and it's not easy to mobilize a tribe of people who just generally support your idea. To, have millions and millions, like we have, I think, something like less than 10,000 followers on Twitter now. And it's taken us at Women Win almost, we've been on Twitter for probably 7 years to develop that. So it's a slow process, I think, and there's no silver bullet that I have. I think it's really important, and a couple things that come up for me is, be really clear about your backbone and what is it you stand for. So if I ask you, what was the Occupy movement about? What was Black Lives Matter? What is Black Lives Matter about? How about Me Too? You know what those movements stand for, and you could tell me in a sentence what they are. They have to do with, race relations, police brutality, sexual harassment and abuse. And so I think stating very clearly and making it clear to your community what you're trying to rally people around is a really critical strategy. The other strategy that comes to mind is bringing people on a journey of engagement. So not everyone is going to fund your organization or is going to start their own girls sports program the first time they hear about you, but honoring the fact that people have their own journeys and it's dynamic. And sometimes someone is just going to retweet something because they liked an article that we posted, but how can we like them and how can we retweet what they do? And hopefully maybe we can meet them at some point and we can bring them along, and maybe ultimately they're helping fund one of our partner programs that's in Bangladesh or something. So I think honoring the fact that there's a journey of engagement, regardless of where your starting point is, really matters. So those are just some things that come to mind in terms of building the tribe.
Yeah, and a couple things you said I really liked. Well, first, just going back a little further into your role as the cross-pollinator, I mean, that is what, when you come bearing gifts, if you will, from another community, when you're connecting other communities, as the middleman, if you will, people find that. I mean, that's a connection itself. Oh, you got me connected to a world bigger than just who you are. And I think that's a big deal because, and you talk about, I like when you mentioned that on, often it's not wrong, but there tends to be a lot of reward, whether it's monetary through funding or just attention to what a group is doing alone. Here's what they achieved. And the collaborations tend not to be, they don't tend to draw the limelight. Maybe because it's everywhere, it's nowhere. It's a collaboration isn't something, you can't go find collaboration.org, and donate to. But I do think that you're right, that's really critical because sharing that collective genius, people to people, organization to organization, is where the real power is. So I think almost, we call it in consulting sometimes the anti-sell. That's amazing how many people you can win by not talking about you. And almost downplaying it and saying, hey, but this group over here has your answer. People really do find that endearing and trusting, and then we'll come back to an organization to see that you're trustworthy. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about was you mentioned the journey of engagement, that it can be simply success based on someone retweeting your message. Or at least this time, and maybe in a few more passes where you didn't think you had drawn a supporter, you've got a quiet following. How do you, I guess with your own staff, people you work with, there aren't a lot of numbers behind necessarily how many different people are talking about what they might read. Again, if you retweet it, sure, we've got a stat, but what if they're just impressed by it and they use it? That's not a statistics you've got. How do you work with your folks to let them know that you are making great progress? It just, you're not selling widgets, but it's this journey of engagement. How do you keep them pushing hard?
Yeah, this is difficult, actually. I think that this is one of the areas that in Women Win's first 10 years, this is our 10-year anniversary, that we've really struggled to quantify. Mm-hmm. This is not, we can always, in development speak, we can always measure our outputs. It's the outcomes that we can't. So an output is something that's like very tangible and happened right after an action that you took. So for instance, we put up an article and we see that we have, 10 retweets and the reach is 20,000 people for this particular tweet. Okay. But what does that mean? So who goes and talks about that at the dinner party, and who writes about it in a sentence in their, article, or who has a flicker of thought about a career change because of that? Or, what girl sees her picture that we used and she's halfway around the world and somehow gets a boost of confidence about that? That's the stuff that is actually where the most meaning is. And we find that as a quasi-advocacy organization, and we don't do policy-level advocacy, but we do movement building, and we find that really, really difficult to capture. And there are some methodologies like process chasing that people use, it's called. So, where you actually say, okay, we did this. Now, if this, then what happened? Then what happened? Then what happened? And you try to go through, figuring out what could have been your impact or what might have been. But I find it really hard. And, our staff everyone is passionate about the work that they do. And they're traveling all around the world all the time. I mean, right now we've got people in South Sudan, in Uganda, in Mexico City, and in Guatemala, just this week alone. And, how do we ever capture the value of the transmission of their passion and their energy and those ideas, often that we got from other places in the world? It's a really difficult challenge, and I can't say that we've cracked that nut. Although it's something that's on our next decade agenda, is to figure out how to measure that. We've actually been working with an organization that's really incredible called the Population Council. They're based in New York City, and they do a ton of work related to impact on social causes. And they've been able to help us start framing some of the answers to this question.
Yeah, and I bring that up because that instant gratification, even if it takes a while to gather those stats, that having that number in business, which is there's a business side to everything, even when you're .org, or you can't, everything takes funding and travel, but that's something that the doing good and finding believers, the lack, when people revert back to their business sense, they tend to lose their belief in organizations like yours and realizing, no, this is why you should keep funding us. Intuitively, this is a good thing. There can't be anything, all the things you're talking about, we know intuitively that this is what makes the world a better place, and generationally, it's going to improve things. So I hope that you can find something, but I tend to dismiss the numbers, or I guess people that like numbers. I know that they do. There are those people, but it is the connection. I go back to your earlier point that you can battle the lack of statistics that the business world wants to see. A social model, which is anything but business-like, in numbers, but that connection is so key. So for those who are listening that are working with their groups, I just wanted to point out that a sophisticated group like yours finds a hard time finding that number, on the public outreach and education. People want to see, well, how many people have we converted? Well, you'll never know. It's always more. I will say it's always more than the number you have in hand, because you couldn't have found everybody that has been helped by you. So
yeah, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, and like I said, you've got a very sophisticated model, and I find it actually encouraging that there isn't an easy way to statistic, because I think it becomes a distraction, to a lot of people, is we have to justify our existence with numbers.
Yeah, which is really a funding reality. And in some ways, it's something that we receive funding, but we also, as a nonprofit, but we also release funding and grant other organizations. There's a certain rigor that people want to see in quantifying the change that happens in girls or boys or community members or otherwise. So if, we give $100,000 grant to an organization in, Nigeria, we want to make sure that money is, and the donor that gave to us wants to make sure that money is going to the intended outcome. So it's that girls have better access to sport, or that girls have increased sense of of themselves as leaders, or self-perception as leaders. And so we baseline them, and our partners locally do, because we don't actually implement programs. We regret that. They do a baseline survey with these indicators, and they do an endline survey. And then we measure the change that we've seen in between. And so while I think your point was the numbers aren't everything, and I totally agree, they are not everything. And when we think about our advocacy efforts, they're absolutely not. There has been an increased movement in the past, definitely 5 years, but probably more than that, especially with international development funding, to be much more rigorous in our ability to measure the change that happens with kids. And, there's pros and cons to doing that. But I think one major piece is that sport for development and sport for social change globally is not taken seriously, to be honest. Although there are millions of dollars going into this, compared to big international development budgets, which are measured in the billions,
right.
Money that's coming from government, sport is really, there have only been a couple, randomized control trials and very high level, investigations that give us enough evidence to say this is working and this is how we know. So there's actually been quite a push in the past 5 years to become more, better able to measure the change that we make. And I actually think that in a lot of ways, that's a really important evolution of our industry.
I would agree. And I think the timing right now is good, because I know that it was the exception, not the rule, for the way my parents encouraged me when they would say, oh, don't worry what those people say, that you can't ever make a buck doing that, or that's not worth it, or that doesn't look good on the bottom line. They would say, no, if it's doing some good, you should stick with it. But now I think it is turning. Again, like I say, it's I didn't know how many organizations were doing so much good, but I'm looking out at my kids, who are all teenagers, they're 13 to 20, and I am hoping that when they get to, their 30s and they're looking to make changes, like you and I have over what we want to work on, that the rest of the world is more like us, as opposed to the previous generation. You and I might have been trying to convince this is profitable, for this is worth your time. So that's why I just love groups like yours, because this is the time, to be, we'll be the people that start saying yes in 20 years, to mine other people's kids who are saying, oh, so this really is a career. Yes, it is. It's not a frivolous time off, if you will. This is a career. This is a vocation. This takes business sense and things like that. Because you're right. When you look at the funding, you see a couple zeros missing compared to a lot of other programs out there that probably just aren't doing as much for community as people would like to think. But you brought up something else there. You all find ways to encourage progress with various communities, for those that have excellence in practices for gender inclusion. Beyond money, what are you doing, again, as that encourager, as that catalyst, to keep up where you've planted the seed, to have those programs do better, and whether it's passing on funding? What are the things you're doing?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. I think the most important thing is to know what good looks like. And so oftentimes in, international sport or development, there'll be, someone will tell you that we have 50% participation by girls and 50% participation with boys, and think that job done. Okay, we're finished. And while that's really great, there's a lot more to that, to serving girls, in sport for social change. You're aiming for a social change. So you have to start with, what is the social change that girls need? So in the north of Kenya, it might be female genital mutilation. That's what's impacting girls' lives the biggest. Or in, the Middle East, in Syria, it might be early marriage for girls in refugee camps. Those are